Hello, everyone. This is Michael Barnes from the Honors College of the University of Houston. I'm recording this lecture on a snowy Tuesday in Houston, Texas. I hope you've all stayed warm and are looking forward to our class together at the Women's Institute of Houston. This is an introductory lecture to that course, which is on Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid. Let me begin by just saying a few things about the class itself. The course meets on consecutive Tuesdays, starting on January 28th from 10 in the morning until noon. There was only one book required for the class, and that is our text, Virgil's Aeneid. We will be using the translation by Robert Fagles. There are any number of translations of the Aeneid out there, but it's important that we're all reading the same one. So the translation by Robert Fagles exists under a number of different covers. Here are the three major ones. So any of these will do. They're the same translation, the same pagination as well. So if you get your hands on one of these, you will be just fine. Class will usually consist of my lecturing for 45 minutes to an hour, followed by a short break, and then a reunion for discussion and Q&A up till noon. We will read two books at a time. The Aeneid is divided into 12 books, chapters, but they're conventionally called books. So for our meeting on January 28th, a week from today, please read books 1 and 2, and then have read books 3 and 4 by our next meeting, 5 and 6 by the meeting after that, and so on. All right, so that's the setup of the course. I was trying to think of how to begin this lecture, and rather than begin in antiquity, as a way to get across to you the prominence of Virgil, his status as a great poet, I thought I'd begin in the 17th century with King Charles I of England. There's a famous story about King Charles. One day, amid the tumult of the English Civil War, which defined his reign, Charles found himself in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, seen there. And while he was there, he did something that might seem to us rather peculiar. So, at war with Parliament and facing troubles with Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, the king must have had real doubts about his future. And so in order to get some sense of what that future might hold, Charles sought out in the library a collection of the works of Virgil. And he took part in a tradition that dated back already over 1,600 years. He opened up this copy of Virgil and attempted to know his future by picking a passage at random. This practice was known as the sortes Virgilianae, or the Virgilian lottery. Virgil was, even over a millennium and a half after his death, held in Charles I's day in a kind of superstitious reverence. He was thought by many to have been not just a poet, the poet, really, but a prophet, a magician, someone who knew everything, and his poetry was thought to possess oracular powers. You could open a copy of the works of Virgil at random, put your finger down on a line or several lines, and the words would tell you something about whatever you wanted to know, provided you could interpret them correctly. It would prophesy, in other words, your future. The only other book in Charles's day that had this kind of authority, to which people took this kind of recourse, was the Bible. How did Virgil come to have this kind of status? Virgil, a pagan poet of ancient Rome in a decidedly Christian world. Well, the sheer beauty of his poetry certainly had something to do with it. Now, unlike Homer, the other epic poet that many of you may have read, who wrote in Greek, unlike Homer, about whom we know nothing, really, we know plenty about Virgil. We have a couple of ancient biographies of him that tell us where he was born, right, in Mantua. In fact, we know his birth date, October 15th in the year 70 BCE. We know who his parents were, what they were like. We know that he was tall, dark, and shy. We know that his nickname as a young man was a Greek word, Parthenos, which means a young, unmarried, virginal woman. We know much about his career. We know where he was educated. And we have the other works that he wrote before the Aeneid. In the year 37 or thereabouts BCE, he published a collection of 10 pastoral poems, that is, poems about shepherds and shepherd life, called the Eclogues, which was an immediate hit. He followed that up about 8 years later with a collection of poems, 4 of them linked together, called the Georgics. These are poems on farming, on the seasons, and on the rhythms of nature and life and death. That was published in 29. For the next 10 years of his life, he worked on an epic poem called the Aeneid. When he died in 19 BCE, it wasn't quite finished. Right? I mean, he seems not to have been happy with it when it was finished, but it was saved and preserved by the executors of his estate, who apparently, our biographers tell us, sort of tidied up any unfinished passages. It's hard to know what those are, though there are a couple of half-lines. There are a number of half-lines scattered throughout the poem. In any case, my point is, unlike Virgil, unlike Homer, that is, a mysterious figure, we know plenty about Virgil. The works that we have, the Eclogues, the Georgics, and the Aeneid, confirm that Virgil was a meticulous poet. Right? He spent years working on each of his poems. Virgil supposedly would write some verses in the morning and then spend the rest of the day whittling them down, comparing himself to a mother bear licking her newborn cubs. And it's true, the polished beauty of his Latin is unmatched. Here, for example, are the first 11 lines of Book 4 of the Aeneid in Latin. At regina graviam dudum saucia cura, vulnus alit venis et caeco carpitur igni. Multa viri virtus animo, multusque recursat gentis onos, haerent infixi pectore vultus, verbaque nec placidam membristat cura quietem. Postera foibea lustrabat lampade terras, umentum qua aurora polodi moverat umbram, cum sic un anima ad loquitur malesana sororem. Anna soror, quae me suspensam somnia terent. Quis novis hic nostris successit sedibus hospes, quem se ore ferens, quam forti pector et armis. Latin's a marvelous language, but it's not easy to make it sound that good. The artistry of those lines is extraordinary. Now, Virgil's reputation as a prophet or a wizard comes from certain passages in his poetry, right? The mysterious episode of the Golden Bough in Book 6 of the Aeneid, for example, but mostly from one of the earliest poems in his first collection, the Eclogues, which was published in 37, but we believe this poem was written probably pretty early, 42, maybe as late as 40 BCE. This is the fourth of those Eclogues, and it is a cryptically worded celebration of the impending birth of a child who would usher in a new age, a new dispensation of things in the world, a golden race even of the world. Now, we know that the poem actually looks forward to a child that it was hoped would result from the politically expedient marriage of a woman named Octaviana, who was the sister of Octavian, more on him in a bit, and Mark Antony. And this would cement the tenuous alliance between these two powerful, important men. But the poem includes mysterious references to a virgin, a serpent, and all of that was enough to convince many early Christians, including fathers of the early church like St. Augustine, that Virgil was nothing less than a prophet who had foreseen the birth of their Messiah, the birth of Christ. It was a common sentiment, in fact, in the medieval Christian church that only a sad accident of history kept Virgil, who died in 19 BCE, from being born later so that he could have lived and died a Christian. Virgil's reputation as a magician, a sage, a prophet, and even to early Christians, a kind of pagan saint, even caused the spelling of his name to change. His full name there, you see at the top, is Publius Vergilius Maro, spelled Vergilius, right? But that name, Vergilius, spelled with an E, sounds like the Latin word for a wand or a divining rod, which is virgula, spelled as you see there with an I. And given his reputation as a prophet, his name increasingly came to be associated with the kind of staff or wand carried by magicians and sorcerers. And so his name entered the vernacular as Virgil, spelled with an I instead of an E. So there's still a kind of magic inscribed even in the name his way is spelled. And if you check the front of your translation of the Aeneid, sure enough, it's spelled with the ahistorical I instead of the E, which is found in his actual name. I could go on multiplying these examples of Virgil's popularity and influence since his death. Any number of scholars have recognized that even if somehow the entire Aeneid did not survive somehow, right? If somehow it were lost in the Middle Ages, right? It is quoted so often by so many other writers in antiquity and in the medieval period that we could reconstruct, based on quotations of it elsewhere, pretty much the entire poem. Virgil is even on our money. That's right, on the American dollar bill are printed two Latin phrases adapted from Virgil. One is Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the World, a New World Order, right? The one at the bottom there, which comes from that poem, the fourth eclogue that I mentioned a little earlier, that got early Christians all excited. And then above, Annuit Coeptis, right? Which is a slight modification of a line in Book 9 of the Aeneid. Annuit Coeptis means he assents to or favors our undertakings, our beginnings. But if Virgil's poetry is no longer endowed by us with a magical or supernatural authority, the Aeneid is still regarded as one of the central texts of Western literary culture. When T.S. Eliot, in his lecture called What is a Classic, was casting about for a definition of what makes a work of literature a classic, he said, and I'm quoting, "Whatever the definition we arrive at, it cannot be one that excludes Virgil. We may say confidently that it must be one which will expressly reckon with him." Unquote. For Eliot, as for so many other writers in the history of Western culture, Virgil was simply the poet. And this goes back long before Dante, who of course made Virgil his guide through the Inferno and much of Purgatorio in his Divine Comedy. But Virgil, of course, being a pagan, was not able to pass into the gates of paradise. And back to our king, Charles I. What was the passage that Charles, seeking answers there in the Bodleian Library about his future, picked at random from Virgil? It was this one from Book 4 of the Aeneid. Ad bello audacis populi vexatus et armis, which you can find in our translation on page 149. In English, it's rendered, "Still, let him be plagued in war by a nation proud in arms." It goes on, "Torn from his borders, wrenched from Ulysses' embrace, let him grovel for help and watch his people die a shameful death. Well, that's not good. It was a dire line to have chosen. And, well, Charles was beheaded a few years later. Now, Virgil was an ancient Roman poet, and this is significant. Whereas you can read and discuss Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, without needing to know very much about ancient Greek history. Very little, in fact. You can't really begin to come to grips with the Aeneid without at least some working knowledge of Roman history. So my job here is to give you the historical and mythological and political information you need to start getting the most out of the Aeneid in the weeks ahead. So let's start in on the historical background. By the time Virgil starts writing the Aeneid, the city-state of Rome has been around for over 700 years. So let me quickly catch you up. The traditional date for the founding of Rome is 753 BCE. And in its first couple of centuries, the city is ruled by a series of kings. During this period, Rome slowly begins to expand through the armed conquest of her neighbors and to occupy more and more territory and incorporate more and more peoples, but still mostly around Rome and central Italy. In 510 BCE, the last king is expelled and Rome becomes a republic, with much of the power invested in two annually elected officials called consuls and a deliberative body of citizens called the Senate, as well as a number of other magistracies. And so power is really sort of spread across a number of offices, right? As far as you can get from power being in the grasp of just one person. Rome spends part of the next century fending off attacks on her borders, but by the second half of the 5th century BCE, while across the sea Greece is consumed by the Peloponnesian War between Athens and her allies and Sparta and her allies, Rome goes on the offensive, and she stays on the offensive for centuries. The Roman war machine and the conquest that it achieved are to this day a stupefying achievement. By 270 BCE, Rome had conquered all of southern Italy and held a good chunk of the north as well. She was now a full-fledged Mediterranean power and had the foundation of her empire. But it was around this time, right, or in fact in the 3rd century BCE, that Rome became involved in a dispute over the island of Sicily, a dispute that involved it with the great empire of Carthage in North Africa. Carthage was also a great power, controlling, as you can see on this map, much of Sicily, North Africa to the west, a nice piece of southern Spain, and had control over parts of Corsica and Sardinia, the two important, strategically important islands to the west of Italy. Each side, Rome and Carthage, viewed the other as a threat. And each was, in fact, a serious obstacle to any further expansion by the other. So when a dispute arose between Rome and Carthage over Carthage's continued attempts to gain more territory in Sicily, in the year 264 BCE, the two great powers went to war. This was the First Punic War. The Latin adjective for Carthaginian is punicus, and thus Punic Wars. The Romans were opposed in this war by the great Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca. But finally, in the year 241, 23 years of war, The Romans won a decisive naval battle, and Carthage accepted Rome's terms. They withdrew from Sicily and paid the Romans an enormous sum of money, and thus ended the First Punic War. But it wasn't long before Rome and Carthage were at it again, and one side clearly started it. Hannibal, the brilliant son of Hamilcar Barca, who led the Carthaginians in the First Punic War, attacked Saguntum, a Roman ally on Spain's eastern coast, knowing that this would precipitate war with Rome. The legend is that his father, Hamilcar, made Hannibal swear to maintain a never-ending hatred of the Romans as a result of the Carthaginians' loss in the First Punic War. So once Hannibal, now a general himself, had conquered Saguntum, the Romans did just what he expected them and wanted them to do. They sent their armies to Spain and parts of North Africa. And as you can see on your map, Hannibal then promptly went the other way, up the coast and into northern Italy. And so the Second Punic War was underway. It lasted from 218 to the year 201. Hannibal crosses the Alps and moves methodically southward towards Rome, winning one major battle after another and encouraging Rome's allied cities to revolt against Roman rule. In the year 216, Rome decides to stake its fortune on a huge battle at a place called Cannae. And there, they are utterly destroyed. Some 30,000 Roman soldiers, if the ancient estimates are true, were killed at this single battle. It is still one of the highest casualty totals ever recorded in a single day's fighting. This is catastrophic for the Romans. A huge part of their army was destroyed. More allies are defecting to the Carthaginians. Things are bad all around. And if, at that point, Hannibal had immediately headed west and pressed his advantage, the history of Western civilization could well have been different, right? But he didn't. It may be an apocryphal story, but supposedly one of Hannibal's generals, named Maharbal, said to Hannibal, "You know how to win a victory, but you don't know how to use it." And so, failing to immediately besiege Rome, Rome has time to regroup. And eventually a brilliant young general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, takes charge of Rome's war effort. And in 2 years' time, he conquers Spain, Hannibal's base of operations. And Spain is from then on a Roman province. And Hannibal, suddenly isolated with Scipio heading towards North Africa and over to Carthage, right, has to leave Italy, go back to North Africa, and try to counter Scipio's full-scale invasion. There is a final pitched battle, as it turns out, in the year 202 between the Romans, led by Scipio, and the Carthaginians, led by Hannibal, there at Zama. And Scipio is triumphant. Hannibal is defeated, though he lives on for 20 more years. Rome dictates the terms, and Carthage must surrender all her empire, except the city of Carthage itself and some of its surrounding territory. They must also pay a huge fine every year for 50 years, and keep her army to a very small size. This is, for all intents and purposes, the end of Carthage's time as a great power. Rome is now supreme in the Mediterranean. But the memory of Hannibal and the fear and the terror that he inspired in the Romans persisted even into Virgil's day. Roman propaganda painted Hannibal as a cruel and bloodthirsty man. In truth, he was a brilliant general who inflicted greater losses on Rome than anyone else ever had, and who for 16 years terrorized the Italian countryside and always seemed to be on the verge of Rome's doorstep. Hannibal was for a long time the Romans' boogeyman. I'm mentioning all of this because books 1 through 4, and I'll come back to this again, books 1 through 4 find the hero of the Aeneid, Aeneas, in Carthage. And no Roman in Virgil's time would have read the Aeneid, seen Aeneas in Carthage, and not thought of Carthage as the greatest, most terrifying foe that Rome ever faced. There was a third Punic War, but calling it a war hardly feels right. 1 year after paying off the 50-year fine, Carthage interferes in a war outside her own limited territory, and the Romans, fearful of Carthage's return to prominence and looking for an excuse, frankly, seize on this as a pretext to destroy Carthage completely. The Third Punic War lasts for only around 4 years, from 149 to 146, and would have been over sooner had the Carthaginians not held out for longer than one might have expected. But in the end, another Scipio, the adopted son of the Scipio who was the hero of the Second Punic War, sacks Carthage, its walls are torn down, and its population sold into slavery. So by the end of the 3rd century, Rome, after the first 2 Punic Wars, possesses a full-fledged Mediterranean territorial empire. And then, during a strikingly swift period of time in the 2nd century, Rome rather easily subdues other powers in the east and finds herself, as of 146 BCE, firmly ruling the territory of Greece, which becomes a province of Rome, and other territory in the east as well. Now, our man Virgil lived in the 1st century BCE, from 70 to 19. And this was a century scarred by civil war and the death throes of the form of government that had existed at Rome for over 400 years. As we just saw, in 510 BCE, Rome expelled its last king and became a republic, with power to make laws and foreign policy invested in various strata of elected officials. In Virgil's lifetime, this form of government, which again had endured through over 4 centuries of prosperity and crisis, this form of government, the republic, implodes. Let me quickly present the most relevant points here. It's a long and complex story and one of the most well documented in all of ancient history, but this lecture will already be long enough, so let me move quickly. The 1st century BCE was marked by bitter civil wars that revolved around a handful of powerful Romans that you have likely heard of: Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian, later Augustus Caesar. And this was only the final, or one of the final rounds of civil wars. In fact, there were a handful of others earlier in the century. Julius Caesar is famously assassinated on the Ides of March in the year 44 at the hands of a conspiracy of senators who feared that he was about to make himself a permanent dictator, another king, as it were. But the death of Caesar does not magically restore the Republic. Instead, a new wave of civil war crashes down on Rome. Caesar's second-in-command, Mark Antony, takes up his cause, but quickly feels his position challenged by the man that Caesar unexpectedly named as his heir, his great-nephew Octavian. In the year 43, Antony and Octavian joined forces with a third man named Lepidus to create an alliance, a so-called triumvirate, a group of 3 men, an alliance to crush their common enemies and avenge Caesar's death. This alliance holds for several years until, in the year 36, Lepidus is squeezed out, and the stage is set for the final showdown between Octavian and Antony. While Mark Antony is tending to the Roman provinces in the east, the 2 men split Rome's empire between them, Octavian taking the west, Antony taking the far richer east. So while Antony is in the east, he openly becomes the lover and political partner of the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Back in Rome, Octavian seizes on this, paints Antony as a traitor to Rome and Roman values, a weak man in the clutches of a treacherous foreign queen in enemy territory, and proceeds to use this as a pretext to go to war against him. Fast forwarding a bit, there is a decisive battle off Actium, which is off the coast of Greece, in the year 31 BCE. And in that battle, Octavian defeats the forces of Antony and Cleopatra. When Antony dies in northern Egypt a year later, Octavian is left as the supreme ruler of Rome. And this is important, is able to promote himself as the man who restored peace and order and stability to Rome and throughout her empire, to Rome and her allies, after decades, the better part of a century, of bloody civil war. Octavian reorganizes the Republic so that while the Senate and other elected offices still exist, elections continue, there is no doubt that he alone exercises supreme power. In the year 27, the Senate confers upon him the title by which he is best known, Augustus, which means the revered. While Rome still has the appearance of a republic, there's still a Senate. Again, there are still elections for various offices. Augustus is in charge. And under his reign, the Roman Republic, as we know it, finally dies. And what historians call the Principate begins. It's called the Principate after the Latin word princeps, which is what Augustus called himself. He was not a king, he was the princeps. Princeps means something like the leading man, a kind of first among equals. Right? We often refer to this as the start of the Roman Empire. But the truth is, as you saw from those maps, Rome was an empire when she was a republic, right? So if we talk about the Roman Empire, we can mean a couple of things, right? The territorial extent of Rome, which becomes an empire sort of much sooner than the reign of Augustus, or we can mean Rome after the death of the republic. Right. So principate is a useful term to distinguish between those two things. And so, one man, Octavian Caesar, Augustus, finds himself the ultimate authority in an immense territorial empire. Octavian Augustus is known to us, and came to be known as to the Romans as well, as the first Roman emperor. Right. So we can call him certainly that. Augustus consolidated his power in the early years of his rule, not only through legislation and public works projects, but even before his defeat of Antony, through a high-profile patronage of a number of poets and artists. He gathers, through a close friend of his named Maecenas, a kind of circle of famous poets around him. These include Virgil and a number of other famous authors, like the poet Horace, for example. In return for financial support and the prestige that went along with being near the center of power, it was hoped that these poets would support the authority, political and moral, of the Augustan regime in their poetry, in their art. And so it's perhaps not that surprising that when Virgil decides to write an epic poem about the ancestors of the Romans, the result, the Aeneid, is on the one hand a mythological epic, but on the other, a historical epic. It's a poem about the founding, the beginning of the Roman people. And it's studded with references to early Roman history and to the politics of Virgil's own lifetime. I can't really emphasize this enough, and I'll be talking about it a good deal the rest of this lecture. Roman history and the political events, even of Virgil's own lifetime, and especially the triumph of Augustus, his patron, and his promise of years of peace and stability after so many decades of civil war and factional conflict, are almost always just beneath the surface of the Aeneid. And frequently they break out onto the surface and are plain to see. So let's continue, and let me try to explain the mythological side of the Aeneid, and then we'll move on and discuss its political dimension. We should start with the title and the hero of the Aeneid. Just as Odyssey means poem about Odysseus, Iliad means poem about Ilium, which is another name for Troy, the Aeneid means poem about Aeneas. Aeneas is a Trojan warrior. If you've read the Iliad recently, and I know some of you have, I was there, you might remember Aeneas from the Iliad. He is one of the major Trojan heroes. He features prominently in, say, Book 5, where he fights the great Greek hero Diomedes, and in Book 20, where he engages in combat with Achilles himself. And in fact, he is saved from certain death by the god Poseidon at the hands of Achilles. And that moment when Poseidon saves Aeneas from Achilles is, for us, an important one. I've quoted some of it here, but let me back up a little bit. For those of you who have a translation of the Iliad, you can find this in Book 20. If you have Emily Wilson's recent translation, it's on page 492. This is Poseidon speaking to the goddess Hera. And he's looking at Aeneas fighting Achilles and says, "Poor fool! Why should innocent Aeneas suffer for troubles that do not belong to him? He, Aeneas, always gave fine offerings to please the gods who own the spacious sky. So come, we need to carry him away from danger." Aeneas, says Poseidon, has been fated to survive, so that the family of Dardanus is a Trojan ancestor. What he means is the Trojans, whom Zeus, the son of Cronos, loved the most of all the sons he had by mortal women, so that the family of that man, Dardanus, including his descendants, which means Aeneas, so that they will not die out, forgotten, with no seed. He goes on to say, Zeus has come to hate the line of Priam, that is the current king of Troy. Therefore, Aeneas and his children's children, who will be born in future generations, will rule the Trojans. What's left of them, anyway. Those lines, there in Book 20 of the Iliad, are the seed of the Aeneid. There was a tradition, known already to Homer, that the Trojan warrior Aeneas survived the 10-year Trojan War and wound up in Italy, and that his descendants, those Trojan refugees, were the ones who eventually founded the city of Rome and thus became the Romans. And again, that tradition is the mythological backbone of the Aeneid. Book 2 of the Aeneid, which you'll read for our first meeting on January 28th, describes the fall of Troy, which of course is not found in the Iliad. Describes how the Greeks, with Achilles dead, resort to the trick of the great horse, how they infiltrate the city, opening the gates at night and burn the city to the ground. Aeneas is the son of the goddess Venus, known in the Iliad and Odyssey as Aphrodite. So he is the son of a goddess, Venus, and a mortal named Anchises. And Aeneas is one of the few notable Trojan survivors. Again, his harrowing escape from Troy with some of his family is the subject of Book 2 of the Aeneid. There is Aeneas carrying his father out of the burning city of Troy, his wife next to him, his son holding on to his right leg. As the Aeneid opens, Aeneas and the other Trojan refugees who have followed him, including his father Anchises and his son Ascanius, also known as Iulus, whom you just saw in that painting, they are in, again, as the Aeneid opens, they are in their 7th year of wandering after fleeing the burning city of Troy. They are in search of a land somewhere in the west that the gods have promised them will be their new home. This land is called Italy. But a storm has shipwrecked these Trojans down there in Carthage in North Africa, a new city ruled by a remarkable woman, a queen named Dido, who is also in exile. And the two of them, Aeneas and Dido, understand each other. They've both known hardship and exile and suffering, forced wandering. In books 2 and 3, Aeneas tells Dido, the queen of Carthage, the story of his and his refugee Trojans wandering. And so the first 4 books of the Aeneid take place in Carthage. As you know, Carthage has strong resonances with Roman readers. So the first 4 books of the Aeneid, Aeneas is in Carthage with Dido. The Trojans, led by Aeneas, don't make it to Italy until book 6. Now, a lot of what goes on in the Aeneid is drawn from the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. That said, the Greek gods of Mount Olympus, whom you know from the Iliad and the Odyssey, are represented here by their Roman equivalents. So Aeneas' mother in the Aeneid, again, is not Aphrodite, but Venus. And since we're dealing with changes to the names of most of the major gods, whom many of you know, here is a quick rundown, right? So Zeus in the Aeneid is Jupiter, also known as Jove. His wife Hera is Juno. Aphrodite, Venus, Poseidon, Neptune. Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, is Vulcan. Ares, the god of war, is Mars. Hermes, the messenger god, is Mercury. Athena, daughter of Zeus, goddess of wisdom and war, is Minerva, sometimes called Pallas. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, is Diana. Demeter, goddess of grain, is Ceres. Hades, lord of the underworld, is known by a number of names: Dis, Pluto, Orcus. Dionysus, who plays no real part in the Iliad or the Odyssey, is known as Bacchus, or sometimes as Liber. Since we're talking about names, there is, in our edition of the Aeneid, a pronunciation glossary for every name in the poem. It starts on page 424. Make liberal use of it, please. Now, anyone who has read the Odyssey or the Iliad lately is primed to read the Aeneid. It's not necessary, but I won't lie, it does give you a kind of leg up. You will recognize some of the ways that Virgil adapts and remakes some famous moments and scenes in Homer. And this debt to Homer is in fact embedded in the very structure of the Aeneid. The Aeneid falls into 2 Homeric halves. Books 1 through 6 are sometimes loosely, sometimes explicitly modeled on the wanderings of Odysseus in the Odyssey, whereas books 7 and 12, the second half of the poem, which are marked by war, have strong resonances with the Iliad. But Virgil isn't just engaged in mere imitation, right? There are always some key differences that are important when he reworks or remakes a scene from the Iliad or the Odyssey. For example, in Book 8, Aeneas will receive from his divine mother, Venus, a shield made by the blacksmith god Vulcan. If you've read the Iliad lately, this is a kind of replay of Book 18 of the Iliad, in which Achilles, the hero of that poem, receives from his divine mother, the sea goddess Thetis, a poem made by the blacksmith god Hephaestus. Right? So it's a clear reworking of that moment in the Iliad. And on the center of Achilles' shield, right, are a number of heavenly bodies, and all over the rest of the shield are all-encompassing scenes of the universe and its inhabitants. There's a city at war, a city at peace. There are men hunting. There are men working in the fields, vineyards, tending their crops. There is dancing. There is a wedding. It is kind of the world outside of war depicted on Achilles' shield. But on the shield of Aeneas, we find, for all the similarities here, something very different. Not these all-encompassing scenes of the world and its inhabitants, but instead scenes from Roman history. And at the very center, in pride of place, is an elaborate description of Octavian's great victory at the Battle of Actium over Antony and Cleopatra. And Virgil expects you to bring what you know and what you've thought about the nature of Achilles' shield, its symbolic potential, what you think it says about Achilles or the world outside of war, beyond Troy, and to bring that to bear on the claims of this new, highly politicized model. These are things, of course, we'll talk about in class when we get to them. But I want to stress here that what Virgil is doing is what artists do. He is building on tradition. In this case, his great epic predecessor, Homer, but not only Homer, but Homer primarily. He's building on what Homer created in the Iliad and the Odyssey to make something new for his own time. Now, there is much of this kind of weaving together of myth and history that you see in the Shield of Aeneas throughout the Aeneid. You don't have to read, in fact, very long to find it. In Book 1, on page 55, Venus complains to Jupiter, again, that would be Zeus, the king of the gods, about the struggles that Aeneas has faced as a Trojan refugee, before reminding him, as you see here in the lines that I've quoted on page 55, that surely from them, that is, the Trojans, the Romans would arise one day as the years roll on, and leaders would as well, descended from Teucer is a Trojan ancestor, descended from Teucer's blood, brought back to life, to rule all lands and seas with boundless power. You promised, Venus says to Jupiter, king of the gods. So there's a sense that future Roman greatness is divinely ordained, is divinely promised. Jupiter then, on pages 56 and 57, prophesies in detail the Romans' emergence as an imperial power. When a son of Mars named Romulus will found the city named after him, Rome. And indeed, Jupiter says that he will grant these new Romans, who were just the descendants of the Trojan refugees arrived on the shore of Italy, he will grant them empire without end, culminating, no surprise, in the prosperous time of Augustus Caesar. Here's what Jupiter says in reply to Venus. Nothing has changed my mind. Then one man, Romulus, reveling in the tawny pelt of the wolf that nursed him, will inherit the line and build the walls of Mars, the war god. And after his own name, Romulus, call his people Romans. On them, on the Romans, I set no limits, space or time, I have granted them, the Romans, power, empire without end. From that noble blood, the Romans, descended from Romulus, himself descended from the Trojans who arrived in Italy, from that noble blood will arise a Trojan Caesar, his empire bound by the ocean, his glory only by the stars. So what is going on here? The story of the Aeneid, the characters and events of the narrative, looks ahead to Rome's status as an empire and calls it nothing less than divinely ordained destiny. It is the god's gift, not to Aeneas himself, but to Aeneas's descendants, to the people who will eventually call themselves the Romans, but who in the poem are refugee Trojans. So Virgil announces at the very beginning of the Aeneid, there in Book 1, that his poem will be not just about Aeneas' struggle to find a new home for his exiled, defeated Trojans. This is, on the one hand, a poem about the fate of the losers, right? But also, by historical extension, about the struggle to found what we know, what all readers of the poem then and now know, would become, in the real world, an empire seemingly without end, bound by the ocean, its glory bounded only by the stars. For Aeneas and his fellow Trojan refugees are the ancestors of the Romans, and their empire, as we've seen here, is foreordained by Jupiter himself. There is much more of this throughout the poem, right? But we'll talk about it in class as we go. For now, as we begin the Aeneid, what you need to understand and prepare yourself for is that in this poem, again, unlike the Iliad or the Odyssey, myth, and by myth I mean Aeneas, the Trojan War, monsters, a visit to the underworld, those mythological elements merge with real Roman history and become almost indistinguishable. Now, putting the real future into a narrative set in the mythological past is a tricky thing. You end up with a curious kind of double perspective. The image of the Roman god Janus, the double-faced god of thresholds and beginnings who looks in two directions at once, is useful for thinking about this. Right? The Aeneid looks forwards and backwards at the same time, right? Virgil, writing in 1st century BCE Rome, is on the one hand looking backwards to the Trojan ancestors of the Romans and writing a mythological narrative of their arrival in Italy after the destruction of Troy. On the other hand, in the narrative itself, there is, as we've just seen, a steady looking forwards in the other direction to the future, to the coming of Rome, and more specifically, to the political stability achieved after the conclusion of a deep and violent series of civil wars ushered in by Augustus in Virgil's own lifetime. So just remember, Virgil is looking backwards mythologically, but he is looking forwards historically, even up until his own time. Now, let me say something else here. While the Aeneid unquestionably celebrates Augustus, the supreme ruler of this new Roman world, and all his achievements, let me caution you against just sitting back and saying, well, this poem is just propaganda for an authoritarian ruler. The Aeneid, I do not believe, is simple propaganda. I'm not even sure it's propaganda at all. Virgil's vision is far more complex and tragic, really, than that. Yes, this is a poem about Aeneas' struggle to forge a new beginning, a new people, and a new civilization from the ashes of Troy. And since we know from both the poem and from history that these people, this civilization, will become the people and the power later called the Romans, it is also, by historical extension, about the struggle to forge what will become an empire. That's true. But it is also about the very real suffering that inevitably accompanies that process. Readers have long recognized that for all of Virgil's approving references to Augustus and the new Augustan regime, there are other elements at work in the Aeneid that suggest that the poem is uncertain about that regime and about empire itself. This is commonly called the two voices of the Aeneid. And again, the idea of Janus is helpful here. One of those voices is the official, we might say public, triumphant voice of Augustan authority and imperialism. The idea that one man has set things to right and we should all praise him and be grateful to him. The other voice, speaking in a different direction, is a quieter, more subtle one, a private one, you might say, that explores the cost and the consequences of Aeneas' mission, not only for Aeneas himself, but for other characters who find themselves in what one of my old professors called the meat grinder of history, as as Aeneas works his way towards what the gods have promised him. So one way to read the Aeneid is as a meditation on this question. What is the human cost, the apparently unavoidable cost to individual men and women of founding and maintaining an empire? I don't think the Aeneid needs any special pleading to be relevant, whatever that word even means. But with somewhere around 800 military bases in around 80 countries across the world, and with a long record of direct and indirect interference in the internal affairs of other sovereign states in order to advance our own strategic and economic interests, we plainly live in an imperial state. Virgil, a Roman living at the heart of a vast imperial state himself, was watching a traditional form of representative government corrode from the inside. And even as he praises Augustus in the Aeneid for bringing peace and stability after an exhausting time of uncertainty and murder and pillage and war, of Romans fighting one another in a brutal series of civil wars that lasted for most of the first century BCE, even as he does that, Virgil also knew, and this too is reflected in the Aeneid, that the power and empire of Rome was founded and maintained through the blood and the suffering of others. It's these sorts of questions and these kinds of resonances that we'll be exploring as we go. The Aeneid is a remarkable poem, and I'm very excited to be starting to read it with you and to talk about it with you over these next 6 weeks. So I'll leave it there. This is long enough already, and say that I'm looking forward to seeing you all on the 28th.